Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the Day 2 Project. Here we discuss a variety of social, political, economic issues and current events that affect our lives. We hope these conversations offer insightful commentary and encourage you to delve into these subjects as well. Thank you for tuning in.
So we are going to talk about racial inequality. We are going to get to specifics about the Black Lives Matter movement and some of the issues that we witnessed in 2020 around the movement and some of the oppositions the movement faced, and we are trying to see if we can make sense of everything that has happened in 2020 and how moving forward is going to look like. Is it making any positive changes? How has it impacted people's lives? How is it going to impact people's lives going forward? I know that you are very passionate about racial inequality or inequality in general, whether it is social or economic. So I want to have a conversation to understand what are some of the thought process that you went through before you made up your mind about supporting Black Lives Matter movement. So just before we get to the topic, I want to make sure that I set the right context, because without the right context, I think things won't make much sense for many people. But with the right context, a lot of things would make sense. So if you look at the history of racial inequality in America, it started about 300, 400 years ago, sometime during the time period of 1500 to 1800. About 12.5 million people were kidnapped from Africa and brought to Americas as part of the transatlantic slave trade. And the sad part of that whole deal was that out of this 12.5 million people, only about 10.5 million people survived that 2 months journey through Atlantic. An average person wouldn't survive that, especially going through that kind of trauma, physical, mental, and emotional. So it started there. Now we are in 2021. We just passed 2020, which was a very interesting year, where we witnessed one of the major movements by the people, the proponents who are arguing for racial equality. So what do you think about some of the major events that happened in 2020? I know that Black Lives Matter movement is not new. It originated back in 2013. Then it took momentum in 2014 as a result of a number of killings of Black Americans by police.
Tamir Rice.
So it also became an international movement. It didn't really contain only in Americas, but there were similar parallel movements all across the world supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. However, when it came to 2020, it was different. We know that a lot of victims of police brutality, it basically shook the consciousness of the humanity in general. And it created a huge uprising of civil disobedience and that kind of protest in America. And it was not perfect, and that's what we are going to talk about. But however, if you look at the series of events going back up to 2013, how it evolved, it is fascinating to see. This is a movement which does not have a centralized structure. Nobody is there saying that this is how this should be done. This is self-organized, self-managed, and it is hugely successful. I know that you participated in Black Lives Matter movement, and based on your experience and based on your understanding of why this matters, what kind of impact the movement had in the mindset of the general public in America, especially when it comes to the systemic racism and the racial profiling and police brutality. What do you think that you saw that was different in 2020, even though the movement started back in 2013?
I think a major issue with how the majority of American citizens who are against Black Lives Matter are going about things is just a general misunderstanding of what the movement stands for and what the movement means. This is seen through the villainization of protesters and protests in general in major media sources, and the refutations to Black Lives Matter with movements such as Blue Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. It's just a misunderstanding of what the movement is. And whether this misunderstanding is done on purpose or not, if it's a part of people's internalized racism and their implicit racist bias against Black Lives Matter, or if it's just a misunderstanding in general because the media that they've been consuming is not telling them the truth. So I think that going back to June, July-ish is when the protests were at their peak. And what we saw in the media is not a correct representation of what the protests were really like. I believe it was either 91 or 93% of protests were peaceful, and the other 7 to 9% or whatever it was were not. So we have to take into consideration that at almost all of these protests, police were showing up in riot gear with pepper spray and rubber bullets and that sort of thing. They weren't coming to oversee a peaceful protest. They were coming ready for violence, which says something in and of itself. And then we've seen through multiple media outlets, not major media outlets, but multiple social media outlets, that the police have been overly violent, overly aggressive towards protesters. And we're seeing the aftermath of that. We're seeing, this protester threw a water bottle near the protesters, so that's why they got pepper sprayed. That's why they got shot at, which is not okay by any means. And so we have misinformed citizens, underinformed citizens who are taking in this information and saying, oh yeah, that's warranted. The police officer is allowed to shoot at someone if a water bottle is thrown at them or if someone yells at them, which is not true. Also, I wanted to address something that you said earlier. You said that racial inequality began with slavery. I wanted to touch on that subject really quick because I don't believe it to be true. Even with the founding of America, when Christopher Columbus came here, mass genocide against indigenous peoples. This was a result of white people believing in white superiority. They viewed indigenous peoples as unable to take care of themselves, savages. They thought that they could colonize their land, so they killed them. They pushed them off their land, and I think the reason people see this manifested as much in slavery is because we are taught more about slavery in school than we are taught about indigenous peoples because our education system is flawed. So racism has always existed. Racism has almost always been there.
So let me correct myself there. I was referring to the slave trade with respect to racism towards Black Americans.
Okay.
Yes, you are absolutely correct. The Native Americans who suffered under the Europeans, who came here to steal their resources and land and everything. Yes, that is another form of racism.
Yeah.
I agree.
So now with George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, countless other names, an insane amount of names, and it's really disheartening to see how few names we were able to recall when there are so many victims to it. So in June, it was just like a wake-up call. I feel like I would say I'm not talking about Black individuals have always been aware of this because they see it in their everyday life. More about people who are unaware of these circumstances. They saw that video of George Floyd and they're like, that's really messed up. And that's why it became such a big deal. And then, so it was just like a wake-up call for America. I feel like a lot more people got a lot more informed, but I also feel like we haven't done enough. I feel like there's so much more we can do, so much more that we need to accomplish. And I know it has been up till this point, somewhat of a trend, which is very upsetting to see. Most people's activism died down towards August, September maybe, which is very sad to see. But I feel like more people have been more susceptible, including myself, more susceptible to understanding how bad racism really is in America and how big of an issue police brutality is.
If George Floyd was killed, let's say 100 years ago, do you think we would have seen a similar outburst of protest and public display of anger and suffocation back then. In a world where the digital activism or the ability to organize people through social media, none of that existed.
Absolutely not, because 100 years ago, racism was rampant. Not even if we consider today's world to be racist, which it is, racism was inherently rampant. Lynchings were still a common thing 100 years ago. So I don't think anyone would have batted an eye. Normal, and like white Americans wouldn't have batted an eye. They'd be like, oh.
Yeah, and we are talking about a country where people argued for the right to own slaves.
Mm-hmm.
They went to court and fought for it.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of the oppositions the movement faced, especially in 2020. One was, this was not new, but the all lives matter argument. The moment you say Black Lives Matter, people say that not just Black lives, all lives matters. What is your take on that, and how do you address that issue? How do you respond to someone who brings up that as an argument? Obviously, they are not being thoughtful or downright being ignorant of what the purpose of the movement and how it originated and all that. But how would you respond to that?
I think that it's just a manifestation of racism and ignorance, a combination of the two. Because when uninformed people who have not looked into the history of Black oppression in America hear Black Lives Matter, all they hear is only Black Lives Matter. That's the only thing they hear. That's why they refute it, or their response to that is, no, all lives matter. It doesn't make sense. If you see the disproportionate harm and brutalization of Black individuals in America, you would not smartly refute Black Lives Matter with all lives matter, or even blue lives matter. We'll address that later. But so I think that when you hear Black Lives Matter, it should serve as a reminder to you. This is something that's happening in America. Black lives are not being treated equally to other individuals in America. They're being harmed every single day, killed every single day. So we need to remind ourselves, Black Lives Matter, and we need to actively work to get to a place where all lives matter. But until Black Lives Matter, all lives cannot matter. So all lives matter is just a dumb thing to say, especially in response to Black Lives Matter and in general, because now what it's become is it's just like a reactionary statement to Black Lives Matter. Because what has all lives matter done? There's nothing we've gained through all lives matter. The only context in which all lives matter is used is to refute Black Lives Matter. And then the Blue Lives Matter movement. Blue Lives Matter referring to cops. Blue lives don't exist. I don't really care what anyone thinks.
Because nobody is born as blue.
Yeah. So if a white person is wearing a uniform, they're not a blue life. They're still a white life. If a Black person is wearing a uniform, they're not a blue life. They're still a Black life. So blue lives don't exist. That's not a thing. And I just find it incredibly hypocritical to say that, to refute Black Lives Matter with all lives matter, and then in turn say blue lives matter. Doesn't make sense to me. But
yeah, it is when you call the fire department to tackle fire in a house, and all the force people are attending the fire, and somebody is coming and saying that, hey, you need to attend to my home, but your home is not on fire.
Exactly.
So I want to get to another point. One of the general arguments that people raise in response to occasional incidents of rioting and looting that happened during the 2020 protest, especially in Portland, Oregon, Seattle, and some of the cities, where some areas of the places were like barricaded, and police or any kind of federal agents or any law enforcement were not allowed inside that area. Basically, they said that, oh, we can manage ourselves. We are self-managing.
Is it called autonomous?
Yeah, the autonomous zone. So my take on people who exhibited some form of violence, whether it is breaking the glass of a building, whether it is stealing a bag of chips from a grocery store, the way I look at it is, so the way I look at everything is as a contract, right? Every relationship is a contract. For example, a husband and wife relationship is a contract. Now, in a husband and wife relationship, if one person breaks the contract, is the other person obligated to keep the contract?
No.
Absolutely not. That is the same kind of a social contract that we all live by. The moment you are born into a society where you have to get along with other people, you have to live in a very civilized society, you, not legally, but you are entered into a unwritten contract. Okay? There is an acceptance level of behavior, especially when it comes to general public and the people in authority. Now, in the incident of George Floyd, what happened was the people in authority broke the contract. Now, if one side broke the contract, is the other side obligated to keep it? The answer is no. And we saw some signs of it. That's how I look at it. And at the end of the day, we can rebuild the buildings. We can replace the stolen chips packets. We can rebuild all of that. But there is no way you can bring George Floyd back to life. So it is very important that we get our priorities and do not lose track of why this particular protest is happening and what caused it, what generated it, what is sustaining it.
I completely agree. I think that rioting was completely warranted in this situation because I cannot name a single great movement for rights, LGBTQ plus rights, the reformation of slavery, getting rid of segregation, that did not occur without rioting. There is not a single instance that I can give you. There's not a single instance that almost anyone can give me. What did Martin Luther King say? He said rioting is the voice of the unheard or something. So when we face these sort of issues and we're seeing a repetitive behavior without any reform, any changes in the system, nothing happening to better the situations of Black individuals in America, rioting is completely warranted because now we're here, now we're at the beginning of 2021, and Black Lives Matter has accomplished a ton. Rioting has accomplished a ton because finally people are like, oh, this is actually a major issue. This is not going to stop. Nothing's going to change if we don't actually implement change. Nothing's going to get better. People will continue to riot. People will continue to rebel, which as they should, because I had this conversation multiple times before. I do not care what happens to an inanimate object if the outcome of that situation is the betterment of actual human lives.
That is very well said. Let's get to another general argument that I have heard multiple times. This is about the black on black crime. Now, people were saying that, oh, you are talking about the black on white crime, the white on black crime. Why are you not addressing the black on black crime? How do you respond?
I think this is pretty much the dumbest thing that anyone could say because black on black crime does not exist. It is just crime. If it's white on black crime, there's a power dynamic. There can be a racial undertone to it. If it's a black on black crime, that doesn't make sense. Most crimes in any given situation usually happens within one's own race. If you look on white crime versus white on white crime is higher. The same thing goes for Black people. Black on black crime is higher than black on white crime. So it's just not a good point because it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, because if you live in a neighborhood of a particular ethnicity, it's very likely that you get killed by someone who lives nearby.
Exactly.
There is nothing unusual about it. Yeah, that's a very good point. So another argument that I heard is the insufficient focus on the crimes on women. Most of the victims of police brutality happen to be young men, right? However, Black women experiencing a lot of issues in general, whether it is discrimination at the workplace or discrimination at school or just abuse in general. Do you think Black Lives Matter movement failed to address that, or that was unintentional consequence of how the movement was structured?
I wouldn't say they failed to address it because what we have to take into consideration is that Black Lives Matter is not responsible for every single issue in America. I absolutely hate and I despise when I see this on social media. You'll see like a crime where a store was robbed and the culprit happened to be a Black person. And then the response to that is, oh, Black Lives Matter, right? That's not Black Lives Matter's job to address. Black Lives Matter, the goal of Black Lives Matter is to address police brutality against Black individuals. They're not responsible for every single issue in America. And yes, I completely agree with you. The discrimination of Black women, and specifically Black women, is manifested through different ways. They're not often the victims of police brutality, even though they are a lot. They're not the victims of police brutality as much as Black men. Instead, this discrimination is usually manifested through, like you said, discrimination in the workforce, poor health care. If you look at the rates at which Black women how Black babies are treated specifically versus white babies, or are the mortality rates of Black babies versus white babies are higher when they're cared for white doctors, while they're the same under Black doctors. So it's just different, but I think it's dumb to say that Black Lives Matter is responsible for every single issue that is in relation to Black lives in America. Their main focus is police brutality.
I want to get to the relationship between crime and economic well-being. This is by data, you can prove there is a correlation between how economically well a particular community is doing, the number of crimes in that community. In other words, in simple terms, a poor person is more likely to commit a crime than a rich person, or a person who is relatively doing well in terms of economic well-being. This could be an issue with poverty and economic inequality could be causing the crimes done by African Americans go higher, right?
Yeah.
So I was looking at some statistics on this. So per capita, an average white person in America makes $43,000. A Black person makes $25,000. Mortgage denial rates, about 10% higher for African Americans compared to white Americans. Now, if you look at the poverty rate, out of a million people, 8% of the white people are poor, whereas 20% of the Black people are poor. There is a huge disparity there. Now, Black men are also 5 times more likely to be imprisoned. And if it is between an age group of 18 and 19, it is basically 13 times highly likely to be imprisoned compared to a white American. Now, I want to get to another topic of usage of marijuana. Black American is 3.6 times more likely to get arrested for marijuana possession compared to a white American. Now, obviously, in this country, we live in a capitalistic economic model where it is by design, the people with the capital are kings. So the whole idea is privatize profit, socialize loss. That is exactly how the capitalistic economic model is built. How that could be playing a role in the crimes in poor neighborhoods.
Okay, so I think what we need to first address is systemic racism, right? Or institutionalized racism. So this is racism that manifests itself within the system. So racial discrimination within law, education, healthcare, all that sort of things. So I think a major example of this that you just gave is the difference in sentencing and charging for Black versus white individuals when it comes to cannabis charges. Black people are much more likely to be charged for cannabis use and possession and sentenced at a much higher rate. This is a result of systemic racism. Just because you look at the law and you're just like, oh, it doesn't say Black people are less than, it doesn't mean that systemic racism doesn't exist. So if we look at the prison industrial complex, which allows for the use of private prisons, which allows for the monetization of the prison system, because we have to take into consideration that slavery was never abolished. It was simply reformed into a way where it would seem more ethical. So slavery is still allowed within the prison system. People can profit using private prisons. People can profit off of prisoners. Now we have to take into consideration that why are there so many more Black individuals in prisons than white individuals? That seems like an issue, doesn't it? Capitalism as a whole is bound to fail. And that's something that we can address in a different podcast. But as a result of being able to, of the prison industrial complex and stuff like that, it's so right in front of us how deeply implemented racism is within society. And it's depressing to think about. It's something that really needs to change.
Yeah, the issue of wage gap, wealth inequality, economic inequality, which is by data.
I didn't mention this earlier, but so with Black people living under poverty at much higher rates, we need to think about what exists there. Higher crime rates, a way worse education, worse healthcare, and this all leads to the stereotypes that are stated by racist individuals that about Black people being less intelligent, Black people having worse health, Black people being lazier. This is just a result of systemic racism. It's a result of redlining. It's a result of the basis of their life. When you live in a poor community, you are more susceptible to crime because that's how you survive. That's how you live. You can go into this makes you more susceptible to a gang, to going into a gang. This makes you more susceptible to robbing because you need money. You need to live somehow. This is also a result of why crime rates are higher for Black individuals for certain things versus white individuals versus other races in general. So when you see like a disparity in wealth, in crime in general, it's usually a result of racism. And people don't really think about this. They're like, oh, the reason the wage gap is different is because Black people don't work as hard. It's really easy for you to say that when you haven't grown up poor. It's really easy for you to say, oh, you just work harder and you'll be fine. But the capitalistic model does not allow for that. It's impossible to make money when you're a proletariat. It's impossible not to be taken advantage of. It's impossible not to be exploited when you're a part of the proletariat. Now we're talking about the bottom of the proletariat. We're talking about minimum wage workers. This is not a livable existence. You can't live off of a minimum wage. It's impossible. So this makes you more susceptible to crime. Being in areas such as this normalizes crime, normalizes gang violence. So where do we need to put? Now we have the police, right? We have two solutions here that we have acknowledged. One, putting more money into the police, which is a terrible idea because as we've seen, the police system has failed us repeatedly. Because they just go in with more guns, more gear, and they do whatever they want because they have not been properly trained. They have implicit bias. They're racist. It's a bastardized system. That's why we need the defunding of the police. Now you take that money away from the police because most of what the police do does not relate to anything useful. Most of what they do is in relation to traffic violations. So we take some money away from the police and we put it into healthcare. The betterment of healthcare in America. It's absolutely absurd that as a first world nation, people are still dying because they don't have the money to take care of themselves. Absurd. It's insane. And the fact that people, the proletariat especially, have been victimized and have been manipulated into thinking that free healthcare is like communist behavior, which shouldn't be allowed or something like that. And it's just, oh, no free handouts. You should not have to pay to live. You shouldn't need to pay to survive. So you shouldn't be pushed into debt. You shouldn't be broke because you need to live. If you have cancer or something like that, you should not be broke for the rest of your life. You shouldn't be indebted for the rest of your life because you had cancer.
Do you support universal healthcare?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that we need. I don't even think it should be a matter of opinion. It's just something that we need.
A country like America can easily implement it.
Exactly. We look at the military budget, right? This might be controversial. How much money is it?
About $800 billion a year.
Okay, $800 billion going into a military when we're not even taking care of the people in our country. So we allocate some of that money into the betterment of education systems, betterment of healthcare systems, the betterment of general housing without gentrification. For all people in America, crime rates go down because now people don't have to resort to robbing people, murdering people, to going into gangs to be able to survive. Now they have an actual chance, a genuine chance, not without people just telling them, oh, just work 2 full-time jobs for the rest of your life and then, yeah, you can make some money. You'll be able to survive. That's not something that's possible.
Let's talk about the argument for defunding the police. What is your take on that particular proposal? Now, a lot of people misunderstand this. People think that the moment you say defund the police, they basically interpret it as, okay, let's get rid of all police departments. That's absolutely not what the proponents of that proposal saying, that basically police, who are supposed to be keeping the community safe, do not require military grade weapons. Why would a police officer who is supposed to be trained to de-escalate any kind of domestic violent situations without using deadly weapons? Why do they need military grade weapons to enforce law? And what is your take on defunding the police, or at least the argument of defunding the police?
So once again, the controversy surrounding defunding the police comes from a misunderstanding of what defunding the police entails. Instead of focusing on how we're going to control crime, we should be focusing on why is that crime being committed in the first place. Once again, the redlining, poor communities, they're more susceptible to crime. Now we have to think about how we can better their situations so they don't have to resort to crime. They're not more susceptible to crime because of the environment that they live in, and better their situations to a place where they don't need to do that anymore. So they can just survive as a human being instead of just something that we toss aside, that just exists in the back of their mind, that we view upon and we're like, oh, that sucks, and we move on with our life.
What is redlining?
Okay, redlining basically, from what I understand, is that when segregation was abolished, when slavery was reformed, Black people were put into specific communities and to keep them away from white people, basically. They had to make their own towns, they had to make their own cities and stuff so they could survive without fear of, like, sundown towns. We have to think about this. Sundown towns still exist today. Are you aware of what a sundown town is?
No.
Okay, so basically...
Sundown town?
Yes. Sundown towns are very rampant in America, and people are not aware of this, especially in the South. There are even sundown towns in Michigan. So basically, it's a town where it's not only restricted to towns. It can be counties sometimes, where after the sun goes down, Black people are killed. Black people are harmed. Yes, it's horrible. So basically, Black people had to make their own communities where they could exist, where they could survive, where they didn't have to fear for their lives. But when this happened, they had less money. They didn't, because they weren't given goods. They had to make stuff for their own. They had no generational wealth to better their situations. So yeah, that's basically what it is.
So let's talk about some solutions, right? Obviously, this is a huge problem, and we touched on a lot of potential solutions, but one, of course, is police reform and through policies, right? Now, as an individual in a democratic society, the best possible way you can impact the society the way that you perceive is by electing an official who support the policies that is good for everybody, more inclusive policies. So policy making is obviously going to be one of the major contributor to problem solving. How do you think that this momentum that we created from Black Lives Matter, how we can turn that into votes and elect more policymakers who are more just and fair-minded and who really understand the situation?
Yeah, once again, we'll talk about this in a different podcast, but I don't believe in capitalism whatsoever. I think it's a horrible, stupid system that's bound to fail at some point. So under capitalism, I don't think it's possible to completely get rid of racism, because there's always going to be a group of people that capitalists and the bourgeoisie are going to need to exploit. And thus far, the bottom of the barrel has been minorities. And I also want to talk about this. I don't think that electorism works. I think in situations such as Trump versus Biden, that was a necessary vote. That was something that we needed to do, because there's such a big difference in how Trump is going to treat America. Well, not such a big difference, but it's substantially better. How Biden will treat Americans versus how Trump will treat Americans, because we saw how miserably Trump failed America. However, in this given situation, I do think that making sure that we have policymakers and people who are going to serve in the best interest of America to any extent is what we need right now, because otherwise we're not going to see much change, which is really unfortunate, but it is the truth. we did see an increase with Black Lives Matter, with George Floyd's death, and this entire summer, there was a huge increase in the number of Black voters because so a lot of people are like, okay, so if Black people are so oppressed, then how come they don't vote? So this is a huge thing that we need to address, right? Because I had multiple conversations with family members, friends and family members, where they're like, okay, so how come Black people don't vote? How come they don't care? And we take it as they don't care, but it's really because of voter oppression. And we saw the results of this. So making it inaccessible to vote, making people think that, oh, their vote doesn't matter, turning away people from the booths, ridiculously long lines, and saying that, oh, you have to go home because the voting's over, which is not true. If you're in line before the voting time ends, you can vote. You can stay there as long as possible. But even that wait, because people don't have all the time in the world, they need to survive. They need to go work. They need to go home to their families. So it's just a result of voter oppression. So with the Black Lives Matter movement, making people aware that, I don't really know how to phrase this, because while I don't believe in electoralism, I would, in certain situations, voting does have some sort of impact on our future. So we did see that manifest. We did see an increase in Black voters. When Black people see themselves represented, like with Obama, we saw an increase in Black voters. When we had a huge movement for awareness of how Black people are treated in America and how this can change, because Trump, once again, grossly mishandled the entire situation, calling protesters thugs and telling people basically to shoot them. There was an immediate threat to minorities in America, especially Black individuals.
So your point about unless we get rid of capitalistic economic model, it would be extremely difficult to implement racially equal communities. Mm-hmm. So I work for a corporation. Mm-hmm. As a result of the Black Lives Matter movement and general sentiment towards racial equality, I think there are more and more corporations understanding or realizing the situation. So for example, a lot of corporations are now implementing programs like diversity and inclusion, bring your whole self to work. And for example, in my case, my company created a brand new department for diversity and inclusion. They hired people to establish programs where they basically train the employees on the importance of diversity and inclusion. And also, it is a win-win situation because generally a diverse workforce is more productive. Mm-hmm. They have more ideas because it's not a stereotypical environment where everybody is thinking the same way, right? Because people come from different backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, different country of origins, of course, different genders. They all bring different perspective to the table, right? So it is good for the companies also, and they realize it. But however, movements like Black Lives Matter movement accelerated that process of creating workplace programs like diversity and inclusion. So I see some positive changes there. So I'm not completely hopeless. Of course, we live in a capitalistic economy, and I don't want to be naive and say that unless this is completely redesigned, we are not going to see any changes. So that's where I stand in that respect.
Yeah, I understand that completely. And while I don't agree, I would like to address that situation has gotten better. Even though we live under capitalism, the situation has greatly improved. We see this. I would much rather, it's a given that the situation that we are in now is much better than the situation that we had 400 years ago. And when slavery was a thing, when Jim Crow laws were a thing, it's obviously better. And I think it'll improve. It'll continue to improve because it's no longer something that's ignored. If you're like in the day and age we live in now, saying the N-word can ruin the rest of, can have huge impacts on the rest of your life, which is a good thing, because we're moving into an era where racism is less tolerated. I'm not going to say not tolerated, because racism is still a thing. It's still rampant. It still exists in a lot of people. In sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's something that you can't really notice, and other times it's rampant. In other times it's right there. So while I think that the situation can improve, I don't think it's possible to completely get rid of racism under capitalism.
Okay, so we are talking about solutions, right? Of course, education being a huge part of it. And the other aspect is raising the minimum wage. Do you support it?
So obviously I support the raising of the minimum wage. However, I'm not very well informed on this, but I feel like, so let's say we have a community where most of the people make a minimum wage. So now this minimum wage has been raised and all of these people have more money to spend on housing and money. And there's a good amount of people who make a minimum wage in America. So they have more money to spend. So more money is going into the economy. And as more money goes into the economy, it results in inflation. So it's just like a vicious cycle.
Now that more and more states implementing the legalization of possession and the use of marijuana, however, that being the case, there are a lot of people already in prison for the same reason.
Mm-hmm.
What should we do about it? The reason I'm bringing this up is a lot of people who are in prison for the possession of marijuana, Black Americans.
So I think that drugs should never have been criminalized in the first place. Nonviolent drug charges should never have been criminalized because it's just another way for people to be racist. We saw this through I don't know if you're aware of the crack epidemic during Reagan's time, Ronald Reagan's. Basically, Reagan peddled crack into Black communities and criminalized it.
So when you say push drug into a community, like through policies?
Not policies. Reagan had the war on drugs, right? So we have crack and we have cocaine. Crack is cheaper than cocaine. So people who are poor, even though they have about the same effects, people who are poor use crack versus cocaine. And through this, even though they're essentially very similar, people who use crack and are arrested on crack-related charges under Reagan were imprisoned to longer sentences. This is an innate form of racism. So even today we can see this, right? Someone using cocaine has been popularized and glamorized by Hollywood, by celebrities. Doing cocaine is viewed as like a bougie thing now, like something that, oh my God, she's coked up or blah, 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 whatever. However, we have something, we look upon crackheads, people who are addicted to crack, as dirty and poor and crazy or whatever. And this is another form of racism because crack was peddled into Black communities. Black people became addicted to crack, and then now we looked at them as their cause of their own downfall. We're like, oh, they're just a crackhead, blah, blah, blah. And this pushed the stereotype of Black individuals. This is seen in almost all drugs. The use of drugs is viewed very differently in different races. While smoking marijuana is found in almost every single high school in America, and something that a lot of teenagers do, seeing how Black individuals are treated versus white individuals are treated, even in high school, is rampantly different. White kids are like, oh, they're just being high schoolers. They're just doing what kids do. And then Black kids are imprisoned for it. Black people are harshly treated in comparison to other races.
By that, Black Americans are 3.6 times more likely to get arrested for marijuana possession compared to white Americans.
Yeah, so I think that all drugs should be decriminalized. There's a very big difference between decriminalization and legalization. While I don't advocate for the use of drugs in any situation other than the outside of medical and stuff, the decriminalization of drugs is very important. So benefits of drug decriminalization include fewer arrests and incarcerations, more allocation into the treatment and recovery services for individuals addicted to drugs, redirecting law enforcement into preventing serious crimes that have implementations on actual human life, and then lower criminal justice costs. So the decriminalization of drugs in general is just a great thing, because I don't know how it makes sense to people to take a drug addict and versus putting them into rehab so they can have a better life in general, because they have a serious issue. Drug addiction is it a disability? Drug addiction is a disease, right? It's something that people can work through, people can better. People who are addicted to drugs...
Medical condition.
Yeah, medical condition. People who are addicted to drugs can better their situation. They shouldn't be put in jail for the rest of their life because of an addiction. They should be rehabilitated and put back into society as a better individual.
So, as part of this, talking about the solutions, obviously, we talked about a lot of things. And one other example or one other parallel that I want to bring to this issue, especially as someone who came from India. In India, there is something called a reservation system. Basically, that India had rampant issues with the class warfare and caste system. The higher caste always treated the lower caste poorly, and they were systematically marginalized. And eventually, they went out of mainstream. So, when India became independent in 1947, the government implemented some policies and programs in order to bring these marginalized people to the mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
So as part of it, they gave them some, they call it reservation. I know that in America, we have laws and rules protecting minorities, whether it is women or racial minorities, ethnic minorities, etc. Would that help? Or do we need to make changes to those policies or tap into those policies to help the situation?
So the basis of the discussion that we're addressing here is equality versus equity. So equality is everyone being considered equal. Everyone given, like in the workplace, oh, they're all given the same money or whatever. Equity is understanding that different people come from different situations. Different people are affected by different things. And according to that, reaching a place of equality. Without equity, the equality of all individuals is not possible. Like you said, equality would be, as people would address it, equality would be allowing Black and white individuals into a college at the same rate with the same money. Equity would be understanding that a Black individual has to work harder to reach that same place that white individual reached because of the disparity in the education system and their economic status. So I think that diversity quota is incredibly important because this would not happen. Diversity would not happen without diversity quotas. And it's, to some extent, it's harmful because now it's made people, oh, I have a 4.0 GPA and this person only has a 3.8. How come they got into the college and I didn't? And it comes down to a place of different situations. If you are in high school and you're in your junior year and you're in a freak accident, everyone dies. Obviously, a college is going to be understanding of that situation and look at your grades, look at what you've accomplished differently than a family who stayed completely intact through high school. It's similar to that. But the issue with the diversity quota is that now we've come down, and not only in colleges, in workplaces, in TV shows, in movies, and that sort of thing, we've come to a token minority character. This is seen in horror movies all the time, lots of shows. There's always a token minority character who always seems to hold the stereotypes of that individual's race or ethnicity. And that becomes an issue because the show thinks they're doing something good. Oh yeah, we have diversity. We have a minority. There's a Indian girl back there. Yeah, she has glasses and braces. She's going to be the really smart one on the show. But that now pushes racial stereotypes. We see this through the treatment of Indian individuals, which is not talked about a lot in media. When you think of an Indian individual in modern media, like Disney shows and stuff, you think of Baljit, you think of Ravi. And it's rampant in social media and TikTok all the time. When I see if there's a brown individual on the screen, people are like, oh, go Baljit, go, that kind of thing. And people just like laugh it off. They're like,
Stereotype.
Oh, yeah, stereotypes. That's funny, but that's damaging to that person. You're reducing them to something that they're not. The amount of times I have been told that I'm pretty for an Indian individual is so weird to me. And people just think it's a compliment. So this is a result of racial stereotypes within shows, movies, a diversity quota, basically. So I think this quota needs to be improved. I think it needs to be changed into something where, although diversity shouldn't be forced, it should be inept. It should be something that's already happening. And it's going to take us a while to get there, but I think that it's something that's necessary.
Yeah, now there are a lot of companies who are implementing diversity in recruiting.
Mm-hmm.
So they want to make sure that if they are building a team of 10 people, like different diverse groups are equally represented. Companies are going beyond certain, historically speaking, beyond certain measures to make sure that their workforce is diverse.
So I wanted to address that really quick. I think that, so here's the issue. We've come to a place where we used to be in a position so bad that now the bare minimum is what is being rewarded. We see this all the time on social media. Someone who says on social media, someone who is like conventionally attractive says something with moderate common sense. Do not sexually harass girls, and they're applauded for that. So I think rather than look at communities or corporations who do have a diversity quota and are correctly implementing it and applauding for them for that, instead saying, okay, now you need more. Now we need to go farther than that. Rather than just applauding like it's the end of the movie, that's the end of the show. That's enough, right?
That's a very good point. However, on a positive note, I should also mention a couple of other examples or a couple of other good end results that came out of the Black Lives Matter movement, especially in 2020. So I work in IT industry. There are a lot of lingo that we take for granted, which are actually racially originated. For example, blacklisting versus whitelisting. You know, whitelisting is always you are listing down things that are good. Blacklisting means you are listing down things that are bad, right? In computer science, there is this concept of master-slave computer networking, right? There is a master computer, then there are a bunch of other computers who actually does the work. They are called slaves. So these kind of languages, now there are a lot of IT organizations that taking measures to remove this kind of lingo from their vocabulary, which I think is a good thing.
I understand what you're saying. Not only is this is not only seen through Black individuals, this is actually something that is so ingrained into all medias. This is extremely, I didn't even know of this last year, but anti-Semitism is so rampant in the shows that we watched as kids. So not only certain colors and certain skin tones and certain features being attributed to evil or good individuals, also certain like ethnic features, like a crooked nose is often seen as a sign of someone being evil or cunning or greedy, whatever. And that's a result of anti-Semitism. That's a result of featureism. That's a result of racism as a whole.
This has been an extremely engaging and enlightening conversation. I know there are a lot of things that we can still keep going because this is an extremely complex social issue that I think in your lifetime, the people in your age is probably facing the first time. We looked at a lot of things. We looked at the history of the movement. We addressed a lot of issues the movement faced, a lot of criticisms that raised against the movement. And we also touched upon a lot of things in terms of implementing some solutions. So I'm really grateful that we had this conversation. We should continue to have this kind of conversations. And you brought up a lot of excellent points. We didn't have time to cover all of them, but we will definitely pick it another day. So thank you. Do you have any final words?
No, I think we just about covered it all.
Thank you.